Okay, welcome, finance and investing enthusiasts. I wanted to take a minute to talk about inflation versus interest rates. Now, we obviously know what's going on, but I think it's important that we take a close look at it and try to figure out what's the impact to us. Because, well, we know what it is, but going forward, how is this going to impact us? So, which is worse, inflation versus interest rate? Why does it matter? And what do you need to do about it? I'm Dr. Dale Herndon. I'm a lead instructor for Investing Essentials. I'm going to walk you through this real quick. It's a pretty short session on why I think you need to be paying attention to interest rates versus inflation right now. Okay, an important disclaimer. I have that all the time. All right. So, what's the issue? Well, inflation is at historic levels, relatively speaking. I mean, it is historic from the past 10 years. It was about 4% in 2021 when we were coming out of COVID. It was about 7% in 2022. Our run rate for the first half of 2023 is about 5% almost. That means that on an annualized basis is about 5%. It's been about 2.5% for the previous 10 years, been kind of going back and forth from around 2% to a little over 2.5%. But on average, it's about 2.5%. For 2023, we're expecting it to come down. The question is by how much, but it still is going to be 3.5% at a minimum for 2023 as things are standing right now. So inflation is very high. But the real issue to me are these things called the interest rates, which we all know about. I want to explain kind of where they come from and how they're going to impact us. Now, short-term interest rates are determined by the Federal Reserve, essentially. Okay, no, I say essentially because the federal funds rate and the discount rate are two different interest rates that banks use to borrow money. The federal funds rate is the rate banks charge each other for overnight loans. The discount rate is a rate the Federal Reserve charges to banks for direct loans. So, in other words, the discount rate is what a bank would pay if they need to go to the Federal Reserve, which they would need to do if their reserves are too low. Now, the federal funds rate is determined by market forces of supply and demand, but the discount rate is set by the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors. In June 2023, it was about 5.25%, so somewhere around 5.25%, something like that, as I show right here. And about a year ago, in June 2022 or thereabouts, it was about 1%. So it is significantly higher than we had before. And I think that is what's going to impact us more than the effects of inflation. Okay, let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of see where we are with this. Okay, so this is federal funds rate. Remember, that is the rate banks charge each other for overnight loans. And I want to point this out because the discount rate, or which is what the Federal Reserve charges, is the last resort for banks when they really need money to cover their reserve requirements, and they can't get it from anywhere else. Then they go to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve charges them that discount rate, which is 5 to 5.25%. Now, they can borrow from each other, and that rate is about 4.8% right now. A little bit better, not by much, but it's a little bit better. And I wanted to kind of show that to you because this is more common for many banks. So we have this CPI. This is the Consumer Price Index. It's called the median CPI. There are many ways to calculate inflation or to get inflation. I'm using median CPI. It's a rate that's tracked by Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland and the Ohio State University. And they track this as a median inflation rate, which I think is more appropriate for us. Okay, so a little more smooth. So if we can see, we're right at about the same place where the federal funds rate. And this is what's an issue, because if you can see that the federal funds rate is going up a little bit, and yet the CPI is starting to come down or level out. So that's a good thing for us, but it's because because interest rates are going up. I think that's something we need to pay attention to. So now we know what inflation is. We've seen it. We've gone out and buy eggs or something. But now what we're considering or worried about is when are we going to get back to some kind of normalcy that we have seen that we're comfortable with? And the question first is, what is normal? we're already starting to see some things are kind of breaking in the system. 1 in 6 retirees are returning to the workforce. I've heard from other sources that it's 1 in 5 retirees. They're doing this for various reasons. For one is they thought they had enough money and they actually don't. So they have to go back to work, even if it's to earn just a little bit. Inflation creeped up, as I just mentioned before, 4.9%, almost 7%, still running at about 5% right now, coming down. But it really disrupted their savings plan. They have to spend more than they thought. So, yeah, they need more money, but just overall, inflation disrupted their savings plan. Of course, many retirees get bored. They don't like sitting around the house or going to play golf, so they get back into the workforce. And obviously, some people fear outliving savings. They just don't feel comfortable where they are. They need to see that they're not breaking into their principal. So, various reasons why they're going back to work, but still, a lot of this happened because of the inflation and interest rate scenario that we're looking at. Now, one other key statistic I heard is that about 30% of the people in the United States are on track to cover all their expenses in retirement, which is down from close to 40% in 2020, according to Fidelity Investments. Now, why does that matter? What's the big deal of that? Well, people aren't saving anything, as we know. We've seen that plenty before. But this issue right here is telling us that the people who were thinking that they were going to be able to retire can't. So almost 10% of the people are not going to be able to afford the retirement that they thought, and it keeps dwindling and declining on a regular basis. So because of that, I believe it's questionable if and when we will return to any form of normalcy, and we've got to figure out how we're going to tackle this thing as individuals. So let me first tell you what all that means. So the Federal Reserve has been hiking interest rates to combat inflation. So the interest rates that they're hiking are the discount rates, but that impacts what other banks can borrow from each other as well. Remember, it's about 5% right now. And what happens is if the bank borrows that at 5.25%, they got to pass it on to us. So our prime rate right now is about 8.25%, somewhere in the, I don't know, over 8, but maybe not quite 8.5%. That's a lot for us to go out and borrow things. And I think it's going to go up even more in the future just because of demand for money. All right. So getting on to the second bullet point here. The result is that consumers are going to pay more in higher costs and higher interest rates. So the inflation is affecting the cost, but the higher interest rates are what are really starting to impact us going forward, because people are starting to use their money or borrow money to buy things, as the last bullet point says. Now, the penultimate bullet point says, while interest rates hikes may slow down in the future, you should still expect to see a few increases or at least continued high rates going forward. In June 2023, Jerome Powell, who heads the Federal Reserve, said that they were not going to raise interest rates right now, but they're still saying that they may do so in the future. So they put pause on it, but they're not stopping it. And I think that's what we're going to see, is that they may have a few more hikes in front of us. And even if they don't, banks themselves are going to have to pay more to borrow money. And so I think that we're going to see more in interest rates, and that is a big concern, because as I put down here, as I just said, the result is that many consumers use all their money to buy things, or they have to borrow money to buy things. So it's a big concern. Okay, so a few more things on why does it matter. About 54 to 74% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. You might be one of them. I know very many people are. I certainly feel like I am. But it depends, too, on the age and the income. Younger people are actually saving less, which is unfortunate. Part of that is because of their student loan debt. And I don't know how we're going to handle that, because many young people have gotten used to not spending or spending money and not saving to pay off their student loans, which they should have been doing. So when it kicks back in, it's questionable how they're going to be able to pay that. But that's another topic of discussion. We'll talk about that later. So to reduce expenses, people are going to have to lower their standard of living. That means they have to reduce their spending, or they can start to save, pay off their debt, earn more. But those options aren't easy in our current environment. It's hard to save when inflation is high, hard to pay off the debt when it's growing. And certainly we can't earn more. I know a lot of people have not had pay raise in years, even though inflation is going up. So Those are all difficult. So the only option is to reduce spending. But that's not what's happening. Many American consumers are forced to use all their money or borrow money to keep what they have. That is, to keep the things that they have. So that's becoming a real problem. It's costing us a lot more money. Where are we now? Well, we're starting to see prices are beginning to come down. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, inflation is starting to come down. That's good, but interest rates are still going up. We still see that they may be increasing, and that's going to just cause more issues, in my opinion, to the consumers. So it's not the price of the car, it's the financing that's starting to hurt us. The interest rates are too high, and that's what is making our ability to purchase things unaffordable. The average consumer is spending and borrowing money at rates they cannot afford. This is just because that interest rate is adding a lot more to their debt burden than what they were expecting. All right, my final slide. What do we need to do about this? So, in my opinion, interest rates are going to hurt you more than inflation. I think prices are going to settle down, as I mentioned, and plus we bought a lot of stuff we need, but now we got to finance those things. Fixed interest rates will not drop if the markets return to normal, and refinancing may not be possible. That's why I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important. So my recommendation is don't buy with credit if you can avoid it, and just generally watch your spending. It's more important than you realize right now. Obviously, we all have things we want to buy. We all have things we have to buy. It's not easy, but that's where we are, I think, in our current environment. Okay, with that, I'm going to leave you. This is Dale Herndon again, lead instructor for Investing Essentials. Look forward to seeing you at another one of our educational meetings.